Psychedelics, alchemy, and the hidden history of cities, civilization. As far as I'm aware, these three topics are not usually linked. By psychedelics, I'm referring to psychoactive substances used in shamanic ritual. And the reason why I think the history of civilization, by which I mean life as lived in cities, has remained largely hidden, is because, in my opinion, not only have we misunderstood the true meaning of alchemy, but we have also failed to understand the role of shamanic ritual in the foundation of cities, earlier cities over 7,000 years ago. So this presentation is in effect breaking relatively new ground, because normally in any discussion on civilization, this is where we start, almost with the last talk, Greeks and Romans, because we credit them with the civilizing influences of sanitation, legal structures, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and so on. We've told ourselves the story that civilization grew out of a farming experiment that began at the end of the Ice Age more than 10,000 years ago, culminating in the high point of the Greeks and Romans, and that we are the continuation of that line of progress. It doesn't take much genius to work out, however, that they learnt much of what they knew about civilization, both directly and indirectly, from these people, the Egyptians, a people with sophisticated rulers who we refer to as pharaohs. But how did they know what they knew? And how did they succeed in keeping Egyptian civilization so amazingly consistent for nearly 4,000 years? Is it because they shared something in common with these people? Indigenous tribal shaman, anthropological curiosities. It's wild, elemental, and powerful. These days, any mention of shamanism is restricted almost entirely to anthropology and ethnography. And this convention today, this weekend, is no exception. There's loads of sessions on anthropology and ethnography, but I'm the only person talking on this subject. It's very rare, in academic circles in particular, that shamanism is linked to the history of civilization. So how am I defining a shaman? As someone who's been initiated, who has been taught how to have out-of-body experiences, to travel and quest for information. And during this initiatory process, spirits will dismember the shaman, strip the flesh from his bones, put him back together again, revive him. A shaman is therefore someone who dies and is resurrected, and then learns how to travel or journey to astral planes, sometimes to a fixed point, such as a pole star, or can descend to the underworld, to the land of the dead, or ascend to heaven, place of the gods, done by climbing the world tree, cosmic pillar, some other form of axis mundi, using the sacred ladder, or stairways, flight as a bird. These are all common terms to shamanic ritual throughout the world. And also common to all descriptions of shamanic activity are the ability to fall into a trance and experience altered states of consciousness through the use of psychoactive substances or processes. And as I shall explain, there is sufficient evidence to indicate that the Egyptians and other city people shared much in common with their counterparts in the jungle and elsewhere. There are, for example, visual parallels with Egypt in the art associated with shaman, and the phenomenon referred to therianthropy or thericephaly, whereby certain animals take on human attributes. These are some examples of cave art from Le Trophée in France, or the Lion Man, which compare with the Egyptian jackal-head god Anubis, or Thoth, here with the head of an ibis. There's also evidence that the Egyptians knew of certain narcotics, such as the blue lotus flower, the Nile lily. It appears repeatedly in art depicting ritual. And we know of an interest in mandrake and possibly even opium poppies, for example, the Minoan poppy goddess. But while there are many similarities between indigenous tribal shaman and city-based people like the Egyptians in terms of shamanic practices, there are clearly differences between them. We might well apply terms like more sophisticated, advanced to the city people. So how have these differences arisen? What are the origins of cities? To search for that, we need to go right back in time, over 10,000 years ago, back to the beginning, as it were, to the end of the Ice Age, because it is here, in the Golden Crescent, that we find the first signs of civilization, the earliest evidence of metalwork, the earliest pottery. The first cereals are domesticated here in the northern Euphrates. No cities. It is assumed that cities grew out of early marketplaces as a result of this farming experiment, the domestication of crops. That is the accepted story. You can read about it in the British Museum. But contrary to commonly held beliefs, I spent 10 years researching this. I have not found anything that I could find in the archaeological record to confirm this assumption. I think we have been telling ourselves the wrong story. There was no farming experiment. In particular, what does not make sense, and what they don't really tell you, is that where it happens, where the earliest agriculture takes place, is in hostile foothills of mountains. Singularly uninviting, is common to one archaeologist excavating a site in the Mosul-Sinjar region. Another said of a site in the Upper Zab not really suitable for farming, yet there's plentiful evidence of it here. Because what I've not yet made clear is that from the Taurus in the west to the Zagros in the east, that's in Turkey, all the way through to Iran in the east, the area is almost entirely mountainous. And this is where you find all these early things happening. So it begs the question, what were they doing in mountains? I will come back to this question. There were, of course, settlements like Çatalhöyük, dating to around 6000 BC, or Göbekli Tepe, which is even earlier. Çatalhöyük was part of a chain of settlements of the Halafian culture, going back as far as stretching as far as Mount Nimrod, but still no cities. Not for another 1,000 years. Not until 5000 BC do we find the earliest cities, at least the ones that we know about. Here, in southern Iraq, in Mesopotamia, or Sumer as it was then, as we call it. And we know these are different from earlier settlements and can be called cities because they have a planned layout, recognisable infrastructure, as well as temples and administrative activity. At Eridu, one of the oldest cities, under an excavation dating from 2000 BC, there is evidence of 17 previous layers, with the earliest dating to 5000 BC or before. Eridu is typical, highly organised, pictographic script, architecture, cylinder seals, this kind of thing. And the conventional belief is that this move to live in cities occurred because of a change in farming, a really significant event horizon, something that the prehistorians called the secondary products revolution. Now, this key development meant that instead of just penning up wild animals for meat and hides, which Neolithic man had been doing for thousands of years without actually domesticating them, suddenly an auroch, and this is a male version of an auroch, this is reconstructed genetically auroch, they became cows, and they could be used for milking and producing the secondary products of butter and cheese. The onager, well, they thought that was the precursor of the donkey, but it turned out it wasn't capable of being tamed. Whereas the tarpan, the wild horse, that was capable of being tamed and capable of being ridden, and lots of things happened from that, coloured breeds and all the rest of it. And the sheep, at around this time, around 5000 BC, all of a sudden they developed wool. They had always existed, but previously they had had coats like deer. And we've convinced ourselves that it was these changes in animals that allowed the growth of cities. But this shift to domestication was relatively instant. It wasn't evolutionary. And in my view, it happened because of cities. I think it was deliberately genetically modified, not the other way around. If it really was possible to domesticate wild animals simply by penning them up, why didn't that change occur earlier when Neolithic man had been doing it for so long? And how come not only did animals change shape, all animal species become reduced in size when the domesticated variants arise, but they also became usefully docile. There's, of course, the chance mutant gene explanation. Somehow Stone Age man was able to spot that a particular auroch was carrying a mutant gene that would make a useful cow. This is a picture of one of my cows from my farm where I live. But while we might know what would make a useful cow, how did Stone Age man have the benefit of hindsight? How suspicious that the outcome was so convenient and so useful? Is it reasonable to suggest that there is a missing link between hunter-gatherers and Bronze Age city dwellers? Because the evidence suggests that the earliest Bronze Age farmers were not former hunter-gatherers who adapted to some environmental change. Hunter-gatherers were not used to staying in one place. They followed the herds, even if they did pen them up for short periods. They were more used to killing than keeping stock alive, especially through the winter. It's an entirely different skill set becoming a livestock farmer. I know I've tried it and failed. The earliest farmers did not switch from hunting herds to herding herds. And what supports this view is that the earliest examples of Bronze Age farming that I have been able to find in different locations always involved a settled pattern first, based on pigs, before they changed to herding cattle. Pigs do not travel the big distances of cattle and sheep. Moreover, the archaeological evidence reveals that the origins of a city was not a randomly organised marketplace. The first evidence of its existence is a shrine. The site at Eridu with 17 layers has 17 layers of temple under the excavation dating to 2000 BC. Others, such as Jakarta Hawks, have commented that the key group of people who are involved in cities from the start are not the farmers, but the priests, who may even, dare I say it, have looked something like this. Not indigenous shaman, but a mysterious elite. Who these people were and where they came from is not entirely clear. And what I am suggesting is that it was this priestly caste, through the ritual use of mind-altering substances, which may or may not have been those I've already mentioned, who were able to tap into a subconscious archetype or blueprint for cities. And this ability to shamanically access the same archetype in places as far apart as Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and Mesoamerica explains its consistency over time gaps of thousands of years and distances of thousands of miles. Few have acknowledged the extraordinary parallels which exist between all these places, and yet this archetype is remarkably consistent wherever Bronze Age cities appear, whether it's in the Indus Valley on the far right-hand side, Egypt, Canaan, modern Lebanon, with the Phoenicians, Minoan Crete, or the Etruscans. The Egyptians called this archetype living in Ma'at, living in truth, the goddess Ma'at having the feather of truth, but I prefer to call it the Ur-concept of civilization, which in this context doesn't just mean the city that Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s in southern Iraq, which I don't think was the Ur of Abraham, that's what he called it. I think that was elsewhere in the northern Euphrates. Ur in this context has the meaning of foundation, and as such can be found in names like Jerusalem, Urushalem, foundation of peace. Let me give you a little more detail of this concept. It's based on the usual attributes we ascribe to civilized living: accuracy, precision, balance, design, infrastructure, organization. Cities are surveyed and laid out in regular patterns. They are not evolving marketplaces. Sacred geometry was fundamental to architecture. These people were capable of engineering extraordinary feats of infrastructure involving massive blocks of stone which could weigh several tons, brought over enormous distances, ignoring physical obstacles, feats that we cannot replicate today. They use the same level of precision whether it's the construction of a sacred building or an aqueduct. Indeed, fresh water was essential to life in the city. Urban drainage in the Indus Valley, for example, has been described as unparalleled in pre-classical times. After all, efficient drainage and controlled sewage has to be the mark of being civilized. And whatever they built, straightness using a plumb line was a key characteristic. The Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh refers to the walls of Uruk as being straight as an architect's string. This same principle of straightness applied to roads. We tend to think of Romans, but the idea is independent of Romans and much older. And distance was not a problem because they knew how to navigate. As traders, they knew the earth was round. The word geometry, after all, means earth measurement. All forms of communication, trade, travel, and education became organised. The keynote of civilized trade is the legal exchange of contracts rather than as a prize of warfare or piracy, and depended on the ability to read and write. It is no coincidence that our own written language is based on that of Phoenician traders. This ability of being able to read and write apparently still distinguishes a civilized society from a primitive one. There's a new emphasis on the individual body, careful through the art of cooking, cuisine, and the link between food and medicine is made. There's a more systematized approach to medical treatment. The Ebers Papyrus, the oldest known medical text, dating from 1500 BC, itemizes 811 prescriptions. The basic instruments they used remained unchanged almost for 1,000 years. And thanks to trade, the increased use of spices, the art of cooking enabled the great cuisines of the world to arrive. The Egyptians were not alone in importing food products from elsewhere. They also cooked food on a greater scale with bakeries and breweries, evidence of which has been found in the Great Pyramid workers' dwellings excavated at Giza. And a great city needs significant supplies of fresh food, which explains the changes in agriculture that I have already touched on, the domestication of animals, as well as more intensively organised arable production with canals, irrigation, terracing. But in my view, none of this is possible without the all-important priest-king relationship, you could call it the Melchizedek, and the shamanically accessed secrets at the heart of civilization. The priesthood was key to the whole project. Temples were often even physically centered within cities. Priests and priestesses were involved in every aspect of city life. Now, it is important to reflect at this point on the role that secrecy played, which also partly explains why the history of civilization has remained largely hidden. Civilization, in my view, was not part of humanity's inevitable progress. The foundation of cities was not random, and it required access to specialist knowledge. This knowledge was not available to just anyone. It was restricted to an elite. We do not see an expansion of cities from those early sites in Mesopotamia. It only spread after a global catastrophe at the end of the 4th millennium BC. And when it did, the concepts transferred in their entirety over significant distances. There was no incremental distribution from Mesopotamia. Civilization jumped from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, to Egypt, to Lebanon, to Minoan Crete, because the civilizers were seafarers and had knowledge of longitude and latitude. So how did they know how to re-establish civilization? No computers, no great libraries then. The technique for accessing knowledge was, in my opinion, through shamanism, through the ritual use of substances for out-of-body experiences. Returning to Egypt as my example, I will briefly try to explain how I think they did it, starting with their relationship with the spirit world, based on a dynamic dialogue and a concept of cosmic sympathy, as above, so below. They knew that civilization was not a natural state for people. They believed that by manipulating the higher metaphysical plane, human beings could effect change in the lower physical world. They also knew that they needed a special earthly representative, a higher order, a shaman, who could engage with the spirit world on their behalf in order to either re-establish the enormity of the civilization project or keep it on track. It was thus the role of the ruler, the pharaoh, divine R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T, as his special earthly representative to undertake this immensely important, difficult and dangerous journey for his people. Indeed, it is possible that the very word pharaoh is a Greek corruption of the word per-ur, which means that word ur again, which means house or foundation, and was the name of the place where the pharaoh's initiation happened. And it may have been here at Nekhen, or Hierakopolis, which is its Greek name, a mysterious fort which had no defensive purpose. And what the pharaoh prepared for here was the Heb Sed, a highly important festival, possibly the most significant event in his life, which only happened every 40 years, sometimes referred to as the pharaoh's jubilee, and its purpose was to rededicate the country to civilization. And we know that it incorporated the Osirian rites, which were a reenactment of the death of the god Osiris, in which he is ritually dismembered by his evil brother Seth, a shamanic description if ever there was one, and all his body parts are scattered over the Nile before being reassembled by his wife Isis. This festival took place in a purpose-built courtyard adjacent to a specially constructed pyramid, which is one reason why Egypt is so littered with pyramids, because every pharaoh had his Heb Sed festival. Here's the example of the one at Saqqara, and here you see the Heb Sed festival court in the front and the pyramid behind. There were public aspects and secret aspects to this festival. Citizens came from all over Egypt to witness the public aspects, in which the pharaoh wore a special bull kilt and had to run around the courtyard. He also participated in a ritual meal called the Hetep. After this meal, he disappeared inside the pyramid for 3 days for the secret part of the festival. It's our cultural problem that we think of pyramids as being linked with death and tombs. The Egyptian word for pyramid is mur, M-R, which has the idea of an instrument for ascending. It's not a tomb. Egyptian tombs were either mud-built mastabas or places like the Valley of the Kings, which has no pyramid. But what has created some confusion, perhaps, is that on entering the pyramid, the pharaoh was going into the realm of the deity Zokar. Zokar is interesting because of what he represents. He had a more complicated association with death than just being dead. He was part of a triple manifestation of the gods Ptah, Sokar, and Osiris, who represented the triple powers of animation, incarnation, and restoration. Writer Rosemary Clark describes Sokar as representing the latent spiritual principle within all living things, the spirit embedded in the deepest regions of matter that await arousal, a description which implies the beginning of life rather than the end of it. And what the pharaoh did when he entered the realm of Sokar was to participate in the Wyatt opening of the mouth ceremony. Was this in order to stop him swallowing his tongue while in trance? And then he either lay on a special Heb Sed festival bed covered in gold leaf, and you used to be able to see Tutankhamun's Heb Sed festival bed in the Cairo Museum, I don't know if you still can, or on a sarcophagus of alabaster or granite, as in the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, a shaman dying and about to be resurrected. And what further suggests that this was part of shamanic ritual are the pyramid or coffin texts, some of which were found at Saqqara in the 19th century by Flinders Petrie, the Victorian archaeologist. Again, it is our cultural problem that we think of them as describing the journey of a dead pharaoh's soul, where it is more likely that they describe his soul's journey while alive, a shamanic journey. The Egyptians themselves called these texts the Book of Coming Out by Day, not a reference to death, or the Book of What is in the Duat. Dr. Jeremy Nadler, an Oxford academic, in his publication Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Texts, is one of the few who has come to this conclusion, as he points out how these texts are full of the kind of language found among shamans all over the world. The texts frequently refer to the pharaoh taking on the form of a bird and flying up. Chapter 20, for instance, talks of the pharaoh rising into the sky like a mighty hawk or climbing a ladder. Another mentions a stairway to the sky, which is set up for me that I may ascend on it to the sky. I ascend on the smoke of the great sensing. I fly up as a bird. Elsewhere in the same passage, the texts refer to the pharaoh flying up in the form of a falcon, to the imperishable northern stars. Now this is a key phrase, because the Egyptian word for them is the chemi. Is this the true meaning of the word alchemy? Have we been misled about alchemy? The source for the word chem in alchemy is usually given as a reference to Egypt as the Black Land, which doesn't fit in this context. It makes no sense. What makes more sense to me, at least, is that what alchemy actually means is journey to the fixed stars, i.e. astral planing to the imperishable northern stars, the Chemi. Now, could it be that the Greeks, through whom we know as much as we do about Egypt, were confused? It's probable that the Greeks didn't even know about the astral planing and the Chemi, but what they may have known about was the preparation of the substance that the pharaoh consumed first. Maybe they confused an outcome with a process, and as a result, we know about the process without being aware of its purpose. And the process was what we call alchemy. I'm going to make a few brief points about alchemy. We know it has something to do with gold and to do with change. Whether or not that is changing something into gold, changing gold itself, purifying it, maybe even combining it with something else like distilled urine or whatever it is, it's not entirely clear. It doesn't really matter too much. If we follow writer Lawrence Gardner's description of monatomic gold and its levitational properties, he indicates that electricity plays a part in the transformation of gold. A typical description of alchemy in the old text refers to something called the magnesia of the sages, which is said to produce an electrical charge. There are references to the operation in the athanol, the alchemist's oven, creating a powder of dazzling white colour, and the goal of the whole operation, as we know, is to create the philosopher's stone, which is also described in various texts as a powder. And how this possibly fits in with the Heb Sed festival concerns the Hetep ritual meal. Was this the meal, the means by which the pharaoh brought on the trance? Is this when the blue lotus played a hallucinogenic part? Even if there is no clear mention in the text of the blue lotus, there are significant references to a mysterious substance called the solar bread. Does this image in the opening of the mouth ceremony with a blue lotus on his head also include the solar bread? Here's another image of someone offering the solar bread. One pyramid text which Nader describes as an enigmatic food spell is an utterance for the offering bread to fly up. So what was the solar bread? It clearly has special properties. I have wondered if there are links perhaps between the solar bread and the cow goddess Hathor, who had many roles, mostly to do with nurturing. She sometimes lends her cow horns to the goddess Isis when tending the infant Horus. Hathor is also the one who nurtures the soul of the pharaoh on his journey, and she had other names such as Nupta, Golden One. And if we go to her temple at Dendra on the Nile, we find the hieroglyph of gold on the outside of its back wall, and the strange light bulb reliefs in the crypt, which may relate to electrical processes involved in purifying gold. Even more significantly, it is at her temple at Serabit el-Khadim in the Sinai Peninsula where in the 19th century Flinders Petrie found vast quantities of a mysterious white powder with no animal residue hidden under slabs in the floor. Was this powder that Flinders Petrie discovered the solar bread also known as the philosopher's stone? Who knows? I can't really answer those questions. But anyway, knowing the importance of gold to the whole alchemical process at least answers the question that I raised earlier. What were they doing in mountains? Because that is where the gold is. They have been digging for gold at sites all over this area for a very, very long time, long before 5000 BC. You might reasonably ask, where's the evidence for even earlier cities? And the answer is possibly underwater, given the change in sea levels after the end of the Ice Age. Mesopotamia had no gold reserves itself, but its gold came from the aptly named Golden Crescent from those mountain areas. And what made the hairs stand on the back of my neck when I was doing this research was when I realised that Mesopotamia, which is its Greek name, but its ancient name, its original name, was Ki-Ng, which translates as land where gold is king, which is an extraordinary thing. So why has this version of the origins of cities remained largely hidden? Because those ancient elites did not want their secrets relating to the use of psychoactive substances and alchemy, the knowledge of astral planing, to fall into the hands of others, particularly the Indo-European tribes, who began to become troublesome from about 1200 BC onward with the start of the Iron Age. The Egyptians, I'm sorry to say it, were especially keen to resist the Romans. But history is written by the victors, and we have been living under the influence of Greeks and Romans rather than Egyptians. Greeks and Romans mediate our understanding and knowledge of the ancient past. Much has remained hidden and has needed to be hidden. We are, after all, still a militaristic society that doesn't know how to fully connect with the all there is. We are living in the shadows of the original archetype and the great civilizations of the ancient past. And in my view, we now have a choice. We can either continue with our Iron Age disrespect, or we can reconnect with the ancient archetype. They knew it was all interconnected. There is no Cartesian split. Quantum physics shows that at a submolecular level, there's no distinction between objective and subjective. Ends and means are also the same. How you do something is as important as why. And hopefully revealing the hidden history of cities shows that psychedelics and alchemy are our connection to a higher order of civilization than we currently experience. It has been done before. It can be done again. Thank you for listening to me. They were poking around in all sorts of places. It begs the question that if they, because my take on Çatalhöyük, for example, is that it was an emporium, that it was a place to store food, and there was a chain of these all across at about 6000 BC, which is why you find that at Çatalhöyük the central storerooms are better built than the rest of it. And you know, I think that they were just using local natives to do work, but the elites were actually making the decisions. But it begs questions: where were they actually coming from? And that's not so easy to answer. But the thing is, you have to acknowledge that there are some very strange things that have gone on in our thing, and I think we've told ourselves a complete myth about farming. You know, that it's all an agricultural experiment. I think that's rubbish. I think it was something in the Jungian sense of archetype. I think they knew how to access this extraordinary archetype, and I mean, I think it's really disappointing in a way that we haven't realised this. Because what interests me is that this archetype has so much to teach us, because it's a whole way of living, because it's a whole way of living in civilization, in urban comfort, but in harmony, because it has a very strong message about being connected with the earth, the universe, everything, whereas we live in a disconnected urban way. That's why I find this, I mean, I wrote this out of that kind of interest, not because I'm an antiquarian, but because I think that there's something happened in our past that we could really tap into. And in a sense, all these people who practice shamanism today, could they please help us reconnect with this stuff, is my view.
Okay, we have to leave it there because over time, and
Thank
if
you
anyone
very
wants to
much.
go to any other sessions. Thank you, Lucy Wyatt. Well, that's all there is here for this session. So please, I think there's some film screenings on.